Life, the universe, and everything. Chapter 1. The regular early morning yell of horror was the sound of Arthur Dent waking up and suddenly remembering where he was. It wasn't just that the cave was cold. It wasn't just that it was damp and smelly. It was the cave was in the middle of Islington, and there wasn't a bus due for 2 million years. Time is the worst place, so to speak, to get lost in, and Arthur Dent could testify having been lost in both time and space a good deal. At least being lost in space kept you busy. He was stranded on prehistoric Earth as the result of a complex sequence of events that had involved his being alternately blown up and insulted in more bizarre regions of the galaxy than he had ever dreamed existed. And though life had now turned very, very, very quiet, he was still feeling jumpy. He hadn't been blown up now for 5 years. He had hardly seen anyone since he and Ford Prefect had parted company 4 years previously, and he hadn't been insulted in all that time either, except just once. It had happened on a spring evening about 2 years ago. He was returning to his cave just a little after dusk when he became aware of lights flashing eerily through the clouds. He turned and stared, with hope suddenly clambering through his heart. Rescue, escape, the castaway's impossible dream, a ship. And as he watched, as he stared in wonder and excitement, a long, silver ship descended through the warm evening air, quietly, without fuss, its long legs unlocking in a smooth ballet of technology. It alighted gently on the ground, and what little hum it had generated died away as if lulled by the evening calm. A ramp extended itself. Light streamed out. A tall figure appeared silhouetted in the hatchway. It walked down the ramp and stood in front of Arthur. Sorry, camera went to sleep. You're a jerk, Dent, it said simply. It was alien, very alien. It had a peculiar alien tallness, a peculiar flattened head, peculiar slitty little alien eyes, extravagantly draped golden robes with a peculiarly alien collar design, and pale gray, green, and alien skin that had lustrous sheen about it that most gray-green races can acquire only with plenty of exercise and very expensive soap. Arthur boggled at it. It gazed levelly at him. Arthur's first sensations of hope and trepidation had suddenly been overwhelmed by astonishment, and all sorts of thoughts were battling for the use of his vocal cords at this moment. Who, he said. He added. Wa, who? He managed finally to say, and lapsed into a frantic kind of silence. He was feeling the effects of not having said anything to anybody for as long as he could remember. The alien creature frowned briefly and consulted what appeared to be some species of clipboard that it was holding in its thin and spindly alien hand. Arthur Dent, it said. Arthur nodded helplessly. Arthur Philip Dent? Pursued the alien in a kind of efficient yap. Er, er, yes, confirmed Arthur. You're a jerk, repeated the alien. A complete knee-biter. Er, the creature nodded to itself, made a peculiar alien check on its clipboard, and turned briskly back toward its ship. Said Arthur desperately. Er, don't give me that, snapped the alien. It marched up the ramp, through the hatchway, and disappeared into its ship. The ship sealed itself. It started to make a low, throbbing hum. Hey! Shouted Arthur, and started to run helplessly toward it. Wait a minute, he called. What is this? Wait a minute! The ship rose, as if shedding its weight like a cloak falling to the ground, and hovered briefly. It swept strangely up into the evening sky. It passed up through the clouds, illuminating them briefly, and then was gone, leaving Arthur alone in an immensity of land dancing helplessly tiny little dance. What? He screamed. What? What? Hey! What? Come back here and say that! He jumped and danced until his legs trembled, and shouted till his lungs rasped. There was no answer from anyone. There was no one near him to hear him speak. The alien ship was already thundering toward the upper reaches of the atmosphere on its way out into the appalling void that separates the very few things that there are in the universe from one another. Its occupant, the alien with the expensive complexion, leaned back in its single seat. His name was Wowbagger the Infinitely Prolonged. He was a man with a purpose. Not a very good purpose, as he would have been the first to admit, but it was at least a purpose, and it did at least keep him on the move. Wowbagger, the infinitely prolonged, was, indeed is, one of the universe's very small number of immortal beings. Most of those who are born immortal instinctively know how to cope with it, but Wowbagger was not one of them. Indeed, he had come to hate them, the load of serene bastards. He had had his immortality inadvertently thrust upon him by an unfortunate accident with an irrational particle accelerator, a liquid lunch, and a pair of rubber bands. The precise details of the accident are not important because no one has ever managed to duplicate the exact circumstances under which it happened, and many people have ended up looking very silly, or dead, or both, trying. Wowbagger closed his eyes in a grim and weary expression, put some light jazz on the ship's stereo, and reflected that he could have made it if it hadn't been for Sunday afternoons. He really could have done. To begin with, it was fun. He had a ball, living dangerously, taking risks, cleaning up on high-yield long-term investments, and just generally outliving the hell out of everybody. In the end, it was the Sunday afternoons he couldn't cope with, and that terrible listlessness that starts to set in at about 2:55, when you know you've taken all the baths you can usefully take that day, that however hard you stare at any given paragraph in the newspaper, you will never actually read it, or use the revolutionary new pruning technique it describes, and that as you stare at the clock, the hands will move relentlessly on to 4 o'clock, and you will enter the long, dark tea time of the soul. So things began to pall for him. The merry smiles he used to wear at other people's funerals began to fade. He began to despise the universe in general, and everybody in it in particular. This was the point at which he conceived his purpose, the thing that would drive him on, and which, as far as he could see, would drive him on forever. It was this: he would insult the universe. That is, he would insult everybody in it, individually, personally, one by one, and, this was the thing he really decided to grit his teeth over, in alphabetical order. When people protested to him, as they sometimes had done, that the plan was not merely misguided but actually impossible because of the number of people being born and dying all the time, he would merely fix them with a steely look and say, "A man can dream, can't he?" And so he had started out. He equipped a spaceship that was built to last with a computer capable of handling all the data processing involved in keeping track of the entire population of the known universe and working out the horrifically complicated routes involved. His ship fled through the inner orbits of the Sol star system, preparing to slingshot around the sun and fling itself out into interstellar space. "Computer," he said. "Here," yipped the computer. "Where next?" "Computing that." Wowbagger gazed for a moment at the fantastic jewelry on the right, jewelry of the night, the billions of tiny diamond worlds that dusted the infinite darkness with light. Every one, every single one, was on his itinerary. Most of them he would be going to millions of times over. He imagined for a moment his itinerary connecting all the dots in the sky like a child's numbered dots puzzle. He hoped that from some vantage point in the universe, it might be seen to spell out a very, very rude word. The computer beeped tunelessly to indicate that it had finished its calculations. "Volfanga," it said. It beeped. Fourth world of the Volfanga system," it continued. It beeped again. "Estimated journey time, 3 weeks," it continued further. It beeped again. "There to meet with a small slug," it beeped, "of the genus Hilfethendu. I believe," it added, after a slight pause during which it beeped, "that you had decided to call it a brainless prat." Wowbagger grunted. He watched the majesty of creation outside his window for a moment or two. "I think I'll take a nap," he said, and then added, "What network areas are we going to be passing through in the next few hours?" The computer beeped. "Cosmovid, ThinkPix, and Home Brainbox," it said, and beeped. "Any movies I haven't seen 30,000 times already?" "No." There's Angst in Space. You've only seen that 33,517 times." "Wake me for the second reel." The computer beeped. "Sleep well," it said. The ship sped on through the night. Meanwhile, on Earth, it began to rain heavily, and Arthur Dent sat in his cave and had one of the most rotten evenings of his entire life, thinking of things he could have said to the alien, and swatting flies, which also had a rotten evening. The next day, he made himself a pouch out of rabbit skin because he thought it might be useful to carry things in. This morning, Chapter 2. This morning, 2 years later than that, was sweet and fragrant as he emerged from the cave he called home until he could think of a better name or find a better cave. Though his throat was sore again from his early morning yell of horror, he was suddenly in a terrifically good mood. He wrapped his dilapidated dressing gown tightly around him and beamed at the bright morning. The air was clear and scented, the breeze flitted lightly through the tall grass around his cave. The birds were chirping at one another, the butterflies were flitting about prettily, and the whole of nature seemed to be conspiring to be as pleasant as it possibly could. It wasn't all the pastoral delights that were making Arthur feel so cheery, though. He had just had a wonderful idea about how to cope with the terrible, lonely isolation, the nightmares, the failure of all his attempts at horticulture, and the sheer futurelessness and futility of his life here on prehistoric Earth, which was that he would go mad. He beamed again and took a bite out of rabbit leg left over from his supper. He chewed happily for a few moments and then decided formally to announce his decision. He stood up straight and looked the world squarely in the fields and hills. To add weight to his words, he stuck the rabbit bone in his beard. He spread his arms out wide. "I will go mad," he announced. "Good idea," said Ford Prefect, clambering down from the rock on which he had been sitting. Arthur's brain somersaulted. His jaw did push-ups. "I went mad for a while," said Ford. "Did me no end of good." Arthur's eyes did cartwheels. "You see," said Ford. "Where have you been?" interrupted Arthur, now that his head had finished working out. "Around," said Ford. "Around and about." He grinned in what he accurately judged to be an infuriating manner. "I just took my mind off the hook for a bit. I reckoned that if the world wanted me badly enough, it would call back. It did." He took out his now terribly battered and dilapidated satchel, his sub-etha sensomatic. "At least," he said, "I think it did. This has been playing up a bit." He shook it. "If it was a false alarm, I shall go mad," he said. "Again." Arthur shook his head and sat down. He looked up. "I thought you must be dead," he said simply. "So did I for a while," said Ford. "And then I decided I was a lemon for a couple of weeks. I kept myself amused all that time jumping in and out of a gin and tonic." Arthur cleared his throat and then did it again. "Where," he said, "did you find a gin and tonic?" said Ford brightly. "I found a small lake that thought it was a gin and tonic and jumped in and out of that. At least, I think it thought it was a gin and tonic. I may," he added with a grin that would have sent sane men scampering into the trees, "have been imagining it." He waited for a reaction from Arthur, but Arthur knew better than that. "Carry on," he said evenly. "The point is, you see," said Ford, "that there is no point in driving yourself mad to stop yourself going mad. You might as well just give in and save your sanity for later." "And this is you saying again, is it?" asked Arthur. "I ask merely for information." "I went to Africa," said Ford. "Yes, yes. What was that like?" "And this is your cave, is it?" said Ford. Yes," said Arthur. He felt very strange. After nearly 4 years of total isolation, he was so pleased and relieved to see Ford that he could almost cry. Ford was, on the other hand, an almost immediately annoying person. "Very nice," said Ford in reference to Arthur's cave. "You must hate it." Arthur didn't bother to reply. "Africa was very interesting," said Ford. "I behaved very oddly there." He gazed thoughtfully into the distance. "I took up being cruel to animals," he said airily, "but only as a hobby." "Oh, yes," said Arthur warily. "Yes," Ford reassured him. "I won't disturb you with the details because they would—" "What? Disturb you? But you may be interested to know that I am single-handedly responsible for the evolved shape of the animal you came to know in later centuries as a giraffe. And I tried to learn to fly. Do you believe me?" "Tell me," said Arthur. "I'll tell you later. I'll just mention what the guide says. The guide, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you remember?" "Yes, I remember throwing it in the river." "Yes," said Ford, "but I fished it out." "You didn't tell me." I didn't want you to throw it in again. Fair enough, admitted Arthur. It says? What? The guide says? The guide says there is an art to flying, said Ford, or rather, a knack. The knack lies in learning how to throw yourself at the ground and miss. He smiled weakly. He pointed at the knees of his trousers and held his arms up to show the elbows. They were all torn and worn through. I haven't done very well so far, he said. He stuck out his hand. I'm very glad to see you again, Arthur, he added. Arthur shook his head in sudden excess of emotion and bewilderment. I haven't seen anyone for years, he said. Not anyone. I can hardly even remember how to speak. I keep forgetting words. I practice, you see. I practice by talking to, what are those things that people think you're mad if you talk to? Like George the Third. Kings? Suggested Ford. No, no, said Arthur. The things he used to talk to. We're surrounded by them, for heaven's sake. I've planted hundreds myself. They all died. Trees! I practice by talking to trees. What's that for? Ford still had his hand stuck out. Arthur looked at it with incomprehension. Shake, prompted Ford. Arthur did, nervously at first, as if it might turn out to be a fish. Then he grasped it vigorously with both hands in an overwhelming flood of relief. He shook it and shook it. After a while, Ford found it necessary to disengage. They climbed to the top of a nearby outcrop of rock and surveyed the scene around them. What happened to the Golgo Frinchins? Asked Ford. Arthur shrugged. A lot of them didn't make it through the winter 3 years ago, he said, and the few who remained in the spring said they needed a holiday and set off on a raft. History says that they must have survived. Huh, said Ford. Well, well. He stuck his hand on his hips and looked around again at the empty world. Suddenly, there was about Ford a sense of energy and purpose. We're going, he said excitedly and shivered with energy. Where? How? Said Arthur. I don't know, said Ford, but I just feel that the time is right. Things are going to happen. We're on our way. He lowered his voice to a whisper. I have detected, he said, disturbances in the wash. He gazed keenly into the distance and looked as if he would quite like the wind to blow his hair back dramatically at that point, but the wind was busy fooling around with some leaves a little way off. Arthur asked him to repeat what he had just said because he hadn't quite understood his meaning. Ford repeated it. The wash, said Arthur. The space-time wash, said Ford, and, as the wind blew briefly past at that moment, he bared his teeth into it. Arthur nodded and then cleared his throat. Are we talking about, he asked cautiously, some sort of Vogon laundromat? Or what are we talking about here? Eddies, said Ford, in the space-time continuum. Ah, added. He pushed his hands into the pockets of his dressing gown and looked knowledgeably into the distance. What? Said Ford. Uh, who? Said Arthur. Is Eddie, then, exactly, then? Ford looked angrily at him. Will you listen? He snapped. I have been listening, said Arthur, but I'm not sure it helped. Ford grasped him by the lapels of his dressing gown and spoke to him as slowly and distinctly and patiently as if he were somebody from the telephone company accounts department. There seem, he said, to be some pools, he said, of instability, he said, in the fabric, he said. Arthur looked foolishly at the cloth of his dressing gown where Ford was holding it. Ford swept on before Arthur could turn the foolish look into a foolish remark. In the fabric of space-time, he said. Ah, that, said Arthur. Yes, that, confirmed Ford. They stood there alone on a hill in prehistoric Earth and stared at each other resolutely in the face. And it's done what? Said Arthur. It, said Ford, has developed pools of instability. Has it? Said Arthur, his eyes not wavering for a moment. It has, said Ford, with a similar degree of ocular immobility. Good, said Arthur. See? Said Ford. No, said Arthur. There was a quiet pause. The difficulty with this conversation, said Arthur after a sort of ponderous look had crawled slowly across his face, like a mountaineer negotiating a tricky outcrop, is that it's very different from most of the ones I've had of late, which, as I explained, have mostly been with trees. They weren't like this, except perhaps some of the ones I've had with elms that sometimes got a bit bogged down. Arthur, said Ford. Hello, yes, said Arthur. Just believe everything I tell you, and it will all be very, very simple. Ah, well, I'm not sure I believe that. They sat down and composed their thoughts. Ford got out his sub-ethosensomatic. It was making vague humming noises, and a tiny light on it was flickering faintly. Flat battery? Said Arthur. No, said Ford. There's a moving disturbance in the fabric of space-time, an eddy, a pool of instability. It's somewhere in our vicinity. Where? Ford moved the device in a slow, lightly bobbing semicircle. Suddenly, the light flashed. There, said Ford, shooting out his arm. There, behind that sofa. Arthur looked. Much to his surprise, there was a velvet, paisley-covered Chesterfield sofa in the field in front of them. He boggled intelligently at it. Shrewd questions sprang into his mind. Why, he said, is there a sofa in that field? I told you, shouted Ford, leaping to his feet. Eddie's in the space-time continuum. Ah, and this is his sofa, is it? Asked Arthur, struggling to his feet and, he hoped, though not very optimistically, to his senses. Arthur, shouted Ford at him, that sofa is there because of the space-time instability I've been trying to get your terminally softened brain to come to grips with. It's been washed up out of the continuum. It's space-time jetsam. It doesn't matter what it is. We've got to catch it. It's our only way out of here. He scrambled rapidly down the rocky outcrop and made off across the field. Catch it? Muttered Arthur, then frowned in bemusement as he saw that the Chesterfield was lazily bobbing and wafting away across the grass. With a whoop of utterly unexpected delight, he leaped down the rock and plunged off in hectic pursuit of Ford Prefect and the irrational piece of furniture. They careened wildly through the grass, leaping, laughing, shouting instructions to each other to head the thing off this way or that way. The sun shone dreamily on the swaying grass. Tiny field animals scattered crazily in their wake. Arthur felt happy. He was terribly pleased that the day was for once working out so much according to plan. Only 20 minutes ago, he decided he would go mad, and now here he was, already chasing a Chesterfield sofa across the fields of prehistoric Earth. The sofa bobbed this way and that, and seemed simultaneously to be as solid as the trees as it drifted past some of them, and hazy as a billowing dream as it floated like a ghost through the others. Ford and Arthur pounded chaotically after it, but it dodged and weaved as if following its own complex mathematical topography, which it was. Still they pursued, still it danced and spun, and suddenly turned and dipped as if crossing the lip of a catastrophe graph, and they were practically on top of it. With a heave and a shout, they leaped on it. The sun winked out. They fell through a sickening nothingness and emerged unexpectedly in the middle of the pitch at Lord's Cricket Ground, St. John's Wood, London, toward the end of the last test match of the Australian series of the year 1980 something, with England only needing 28 runs to win. Important fact from the Galactic History, number 1, reproduced from the Sidereal Daily Mentioner's book of popular galactic history. The night sky over the planet Cricket is the least interesting sight in the entire universe. It was a charming and delightful day at Lord's as Ford and Arthur tumbled haphazardly out of a space-time anomaly and hit the immaculate turf rather hard. The applause of the crowd was tremendous. It wasn't for them, but instinctively they bowed anyway, which was fortunate because the small red heavy ball that the crowd actually had been applauding whistled mere inches over Arthur's head. They threw themselves back to the ground that seemed to spin hideously around them. What was that? Hissed Arthur. Something red, hissed Ford back at him. Where are we? Somewhere green. Shapes, muttered Arthur. I need shapes. The applause of the crowd had been rapidly succeeded by gasps of astonishment, and the awkward titters of hundreds of people who could not yet make up their minds whether to believe what they had just seen or not. This your sofa? Said a voice. What was that? Whispered Ford. Arthur looked up. Something blue, he said. Shape? Asked Ford. Arthur looked again. It is shaped, he hissed at Ford with his brow savagely furrowed, like a policeman. They remained crouched there for a few moments, frowning deeply. The blue thing, shaped like a policeman, tapped them both on the shoulders. Come on, you two, the shape said. Let's go. These words had an electrifying effect on Arthur. He leaped to his feet and shot a series of startled glances at the panorama around him that had suddenly settled down into something of quite terrifying ordinariness. Where did you get this from? He yelled at the policeman's shape. What did you say? Said the startled shape. This is Lord's cricket ground, isn't it? Snapped Arthur. Where did you find it? How did you get it here? I think, he added, clasping his hand to his brow, that I had better calm down. He squatted down and abruptly in front of Ford. It is a policeman, he said. What do we do? Ford shrugged. What do you want to do? He said. I want you, said Arthur, to tell me that I have been dreaming for the last 5 years. Ford shrugged again and obliged. You've been dreaming for the last 5 years, he said. Arthur got to his feet. It's all right, officer. I've been dreaming for the last 5 years. Ask him. He added, pointing at Ford. He was in it. Having said this, he sauntered off toward the edge of the pitch, brushing down his dressing gown. He then noticed his dressing gown and stopped. He stared at it. He turned around. He flung himself at the policeman. So where did I get these clothes from? He howled. He collapsed and lay twitching on the grass. Ford shook his head. He's had a bad 2 million years, he said to the policeman. Together, they heaved Arthur onto the sofa and carried him off the pitch, and were only briefly hampered by the sudden disappearance of the sofa on the way. Reactions to all this from the crowd were many and various. Most of them couldn't cope with watching it and listened to it on the radio instead. Well, this is an interesting incident, Brian, said one radio commentator to another. I don't think there have been any mysterious materializations on the pitch well, I don't think there have been any, have there, that I recall. Edgbaston, 1932? Ah, now what happened then? Well, Peter, I think that was the canter facing Wilcox coming up to bowl from the pavilion end where a spectator suddenly ran straight across the pitch. There was a pause while the first commentator considered this. Yes, he said. Yes, there's nothing actually very mysterious about that, is there? He didn't actually materialize, did he? He just ran on. No, that's true, but he did claim to have seen something materialize on the pitch. Ah, did he? Yes, an alligator, I think, of some description. And what happened to the man? Well, I think someone offered to take him off and give him some lunch, but he explained that he'd already had a rather good one, so the matter was dropped, and Warwickshire went on to win by 3 wickets. So, not very like this current instance. For those of you who've just tuned in, you may be interested to know that two rather scruffily attired men, and indeed a sofa, a Chesterfield, I think, yes, a Chesterfield, have just materialized here in the middle of Lord's cricket ground. But I don't think they meant any harm, and they've been very good-natured about it, and sorry, can I interrupt you for a moment, Peter, and say that the sofa has just vanished? So it has. Well, that's one mystery less. Still, it's definitely one for the record books, I think, particularly occurring at this dramatic moment in play, England now needing only 24 runs to win the series. The men are leaving the pitch in the company of a police officer, and I think everyone's settling down now and play is about to resume. Now, sir, said the policeman after they had made a passage through the curious crowd and laid Arthur's peacefully inert body on a blanket, perhaps you'd care to tell me who you are, where you come from, and what that little scene was all about. Ford looked at the ground for a moment as if steadying himself for something. Then he straightened up and aimed a look at the policeman that hit him with the full force of every inch of the 6 light-years distance between Earth and Ford's home near Beetlejuice. All right, said Ford very quietly. I'll tell you. Yes, well, that won't be necessary, said the policeman hurriedly. Just don't let whatever it was happen again. The policeman turned around and wandered off in search of anyone who wasn't from Beetlejuice. Fortunately, the cricket ground was full of them. Arthur's consciousness approached his body as from a great distance, and reluctantly. It had had some bad times in there. Slowly, nervously, it entered it and settled down into its accustomed position. Arthur sat up. Where am I? He said. Lord's cricket ground, said Ford. Fine, said Arthur, and his consciousness stepped out again for a quick breather. His body flopped back on the grass. 10 minutes later, hunched over a cup of tea in the refreshment tent, the color started to come back to his haggard face. How you feeling? Asked Ford. I'm home, said Arthur hoarsely. He closed his eyes and greedily inhaled the steam from his tea as if it were, well, as far as Arthur was concerned, as if it were tea, which it was. I'm home, he repeated. Home. It's England. It's today. The nightmare is over. He opened his eyes again and smiled serenely. I'm where I belong, he said in an emotional whisper. There are two things I feel I should tell you, said Ford, tossing a copy of The Guardian over the table at him. I'm home, said Arthur. Yes, said Ford. One is, he said, pointing at the date on the top of the paper, that the earth will be demolished in 2 days' time. I'm home, said Arthur. Tea, he said. Cricket, he added, with pleasure. Mown grass, wooden benches, white linen jackets, beer cans. Slowly, he began to focus on the newspaper. He cocked his head on one side with a slight frown. I've seen that one before, he said. His eyes wandered slowly up to the date, which Ford was idly tapping at. His face froze for a second or two and then began to do that terribly slow crashing trick that Arctic ice floes do so spectacularly in the spring. And the other thing, said Ford, is that you appear to have a bone in your beard. He tossed back his tea. Outside the refreshment tent, the sun was shining on a happy crowd. It shone on white hats and red faces. It shone on popsicles and melted them. It shone on the tears of small children whose popsicles had just melted and fallen off the stick. It shone on the trees. It flashed off whirling cricket bats. It gleamed off the utterly extraordinary object that was parked behind the sight screens and that nobody appeared to have noticed. I don't know why it's doing that today. And that nobody had appeared to have noticed. It beamed on Ford and Arthur as they emerged blinking from the refreshment tent and surveyed the scene around them. Arthur was shaking. Perhaps, he said, I should. No, said Ford sharply. What? Don't try and phone yourself up at home. How did you? Ford shrugged. But why not? Said Arthur. People who talk to themselves on the phone never learn anything to their advantage. But look, said Ford. He picked up an imaginary phone and dialed an imaginary dial. Hello, he said into the imaginary mouthpiece. Is that Arthur Dent? Ah, yes, hello. This is Arthur Dent speaking. Don't hang up. He looked at the imaginary phone in disappointment. He hung up, he said, shrugged, and put the imaginary phone neatly back on its imaginary hook. This is not my first temporal anomaly, he added. A glummer look replaced the already glum look on Arthur Dent's face. So we're not home and dry, he said. We could even be said, replied Ford, to be home and vigorously toweling ourselves off. The cricket game continued. The bowler approached the wicket at a lope, a trot, and then a run. He suddenly exploded in a flurry of arms and legs, out of which flew a ball. The batsman swung and thwacked it behind him over the sight screens. Ford's eyes followed the trajectory of the ball and jogged momentarily. He stiffened. He looked along the flight path of the ball again, and his eyes twitched again. This isn't my towel, said Arthur, who was rummaging in his rabbit skin bag. Shh, said Ford. He screwed his eyes up in concentration. I had a Golgafrinchen jogging towel, continued Arthur. It was blue with yellow stars on it. This isn't it. Shh, said Ford again. He covered one eye and looked with the other. This one's pink, said Arthur. It isn't yours, is it? I would like you to shut up about your towel, said Ford. It isn't my towel, insisted Arthur. That is the point I'm trying to. And the time at which I would like you to shut up about it, continued Ford in a low growl, is now. All right, said Arthur, starting to stuff it back into the primitively stitched rabbit skin bag. I realize that it is probably not important in the cosmic scale of things. It's just odd, that's all. Pink towel suddenly instead of a blue one with yellow stars. Ford was beginning to behave rather strangely, or rather, not actually beginning to behave strangely, but beginning to behave in a way that was strangely different from the other strange ways in which he more regularly behaved. What he was doing was this. Regardless of the bemused stares it was provoking from his fellow members of the crowd gathered round the pitch, he was waving his hands in sharp movements across his face, ducking down behind some people, leaping up behind others, then standing still and blinking a lot. After a moment or two of this, he started to stalk forward slowly and stealthily, wearing a puzzled frown of concentration, like a leopard that is not sure whether it's just seen a half-empty tin of cat food half a mile away across a hot and dusty plain. This isn't my bag either, said Arthur suddenly. Ford's spell of concentration was broken. He turned angrily on Arthur. I wasn't talking about my towel, said Arthur. We've established that it isn't mine. It's just that the bag into which I was putting the towel is not mine, is also mine, not mine, though it is extraordinarily similar. Now, personally, I think that is extremely odd, especially as the bag was one I made myself on prehistoric Earth. These are also not my stones, he added, pulling a few flat gray stones out of the bag. I was making a collection of interesting stones, and these are clearly very dull ones. A roar of excitement thrilled through the crowd and obliterated whatever it was Ford said in reply to this piece of information. The cricket ball that had excited this reaction fell out of the sky and dropped neatly into Arthur's mysterious rabbit skin bag. Now, I would say that that is also a very curious event, said Arthur, rapidly closing the bag, pretending to look for the ball on the ground. I don't think it's here, he said to the small boys who immediately clustered around him to join in the search. It probably rolled off somewhere. Over there, I expect. He pointed vaguely in the direction of which he wished they would push off. One of the boys looked at him quizzically. You all right? Said the boy. No, said Arthur. That why you got a bone in your beard? Said the boy. I'm training it to like being wherever it's put. Arthur prided himself on saying this. It was, he thought, exactly the sort of thing that would entertain and stimulate young minds. Oh, said the small boy, putting his head on one side and thinking about it. What's your name? Dent, said Arthur. Arthur Dent. You're a jerk, Dent, said the boy, a complete knee-biter. The boy looked past him at something else, to show that he wasn't in any particular hurry to run away, and then wandered off, scratching his nose. Suddenly, Arthur remembered that the earth was going to be demolished again in 2 days' time, and just this once didn't feel too bad about it. Play resumed with a new ball, the sun continued to shine, and Ford continued to jump up and down, shaking his head and blinking. Something's on your mind, isn't it? Said Arthur. I think, said Ford in a tone of voice that Arthur by now recognized as one that presaged something utterly unintelligible, that there's an SEP over there. He pointed. Curiously enough, the direction he pointed was not the one in which he was looking. Arthur looked in the one direction, which was toward the sight screens, and in the other, which was at the field of play. He nodded. He shrugged. He shrugged again. A what? He said. An SEP. An SEP. And what's that? Somebody else's problem, said Ford. Ah, good, said Arthur, and relaxed. He had no idea what all that was about, but at least it seemed to be over. It wasn't. Over there, said Ford, again pointing at the sight screens and looking at the pitch. Where? Said Arthur. There, said Ford. I see, said Arthur, who didn't. You do? What? Can you see, said Ford patiently, the SEP? I thought you said it was someone else's problem. That's right. Arthur nodded slowly, carefully, and with an air of immense stupidity. And I want to know, said Ford, if you can see it. You do? Yes. What, said Arthur, does it look like? Well, how should I know, you fool? If you can see it, you tell me. Arthur experienced that dull throbbing sensation just behind the temples that was a hallmark of so many of his conversations with Ford. His brain lurked like a frightened puppy in its kennel. Ford took him by the arm. An SEP, he said, is something that we can't see, or don't see, or our brain doesn't let us see, because we think that it's somebody else's problem. That's what SEP means, somebody else's problem. The brain just edits it out. It's like a blind spot. If you look at it directly, you won't see it unless you know precisely what it is. Your only hope is to catch it by surprise out of the corner of your eye. Ah, said Arthur. Then that's why, yes, said Ford, who knew what Arthur was going to say. You've been jumping up, yes, down and blinking, yes, and I think you've got the message. I can see it, said Arthur. It's a spaceship. For a moment, Arthur was stunned by the reaction this revelation provoked. A roar erupted from the crowd, and from every direction people were running and shouting, yelling, tumbling over one another in a tumult of confusion. He stumbled back in astonishment and glanced fearfully around. Then he glanced around again in ever greater astonishment. Exciting, isn't it? Said an apparition. The apparition wobbled in front of Arthur's eyes, though the truth of the matter is probably that Arthur's eyes were wobbling in front of the apparition. His mouth wobbled as well. Woo, 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 his mouth said. I think your team has just won, said the apparition. Woo, 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 repeated Arthur, and punctuated each wobble with a prod at Ford Prefect's back. Ford was staring at the tumult in trepidation. You are English, aren't you? Said the apparition. Yes, said Arthur. Well, your team, as I say, has just won the match. It means they retain the Ashes. You must be very pleased. I must say, I'm rather fond of cricket, though I wouldn't like anyone outside the planet to hear me saying that. Oh dear, no. The apparition gave what might have been a mischievous grin, but it was hard to tell because the sun was directly behind him, creating a blinding halo around his head and illuminating his silver hair and beard in a way that was awesome, dramatic, and hard to reconcile with mischievous grins. Still, he said, it'll all be over in a couple days, won't it? Though, as I said to you when we last met, I was very, very sorry about that. Still, whatever will have been, will have been. Arthur tried to speak, but gave up the unequal struggle. He prodded Ford again. I thought something terrible had happened, said Ford, but it's just the end of the game. We ought to get out. Oh, hello, Slarty Bartfast. What are you doing here? Oh, pottering, pottering, said the old man gravely. That your ship? Can you give us a lift anywhere? Patience, patience, the old man admonished. Okay, said Ford. It's just that this planet's going to be demolished pretty soon. I know that, said Slarty Bartfast. And, well, I just wanted to make that point, said Ford. The point is taken. And if you feel that you really want to hang around a cricket pitch at this point, I do, then it's your ship, it is. I suppose. Ford turned away sharply at this point. Hello, Slotty Bartfast, said Arthur at last. Hello, Earthman, said Slarty Bartfast. After all, said Ford, we can only die once. The old man ignored this and stared keenly onto the pitch, with eyes that seemed alive, with expressions that had no apparent bearing on what was happening out there. What was happening was that the crowd was gathering itself into a wide circle around the center of the pitch. What Slarty Bartfast saw in it, he alone knew. Ford was humming something. It was just one note repeated at intervals. He was hoping that somebody would ask him what he was humming, but nobody did. If anybody had asked him, he would have said that he was humming the first line of a Noel Coward song called Mad About the Boy over and over again. It would then have been pointed out to him that he was only singing one note, to which he would have replied that for reasons that he hoped would be apparent, he was omitting the about the boy bit. He was annoyed that nobody asked. It's just, he burst out at last, that if we don't go soon, we might get caught in the middle of it all again. And there's nothing that depresses me more than seeing a planet being destroyed, except possibly still being on it when it happens. Or, he added in an undertone, hanging around cricket matches. Patience, said Slarty Bartfast again. Great things are afoot. That's what you said last time we met, said Arthur. They were, said Slarty Bartfast. Yes, that's true, admitted Arthur. All, however, that seemed to be afoot was a ceremony of some kind. It was being specially staged for the benefit of television rather than the spectators, and all they could gather about it from where they were standing was that what they heard from a nearby radio. Ford was aggressively uninterested. He fretted as he heard it explained that the Ashes were about to be presented to the captain of the English team out there on the pitch, fumed when told that this was because they had now won it for the nth time, positively barked with annoyance at the information that the ashes were the remains of a cricket stump, and when further into this, he asked to contend with the fact that the cricket stump in question had been burnt in Melbourne, Australia in 1882 to signify the death of English cricket, he rounded on Slartibartfast, fast, took a deep breath, but didn't have a chance to say anything because the old man wasn't there. He was marching out onto the pitch with terrible purpose in his gait. His hair, beard, and robes swept behind him, looking very much as Moses would have if Sinai had been a well-cut lawn instead of, as it is more usually represented, a fiery smoking mountain. I'm going to stop there for today.